Good morning or afternoon to all those. Thanks for joining us today for Spooky FSMA Fridays. Happy Halloween and welcome to today's topic. It's actually part 2 of the second review cycle, and we're going to focus today on the foreign supplier verification rule. My name is Jill Bender. I'm with SafetyChain Software, and before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping tips, please. If you've joined us on WebEx, if you're having technical issues, go ahead and dial 877-509-3239 for technical support. Again, 877-509-3239. As a reminder, a recording of today's session will be sent by end of day next Monday. If you have questions you'd like to submit, it's online only, so you do need to be logged on for that, although I do have a couple pre-submitted questions that people email me. Thank you very much. And then as always, for your privacy, we have all the participants. You will not be able to see who's online with us today, but as always, we have quite the crowd, and we're very excited to have everyone with us today. For today's session, we have Dr. David Atchison with the Atchison Group, and also Melanie Newman. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us as always, and we will just go ahead and get started. So David, let's kick off. What's the latest on FSMA?
Well, thanks, Jill. Pleasure to be with you again, and thanks to everybody for joining us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Nothing majorly new on FSMA. Obviously, we're all focused on the reproposals, 4 of them which have come out. We're going to talk about one of those today on foreign supplier, but the 2 preventive control rules and the produce. I think the biggest update or reminder is that comments are due on these 4 rules by about mid-December time. And other than that, it's fairly quiet on the FSMA front, but lots of reproposals to get through.
Okay, great. Well, let's just dive in mid-December. That's coming up quite quickly, isn't it? So, David, let's go ahead and kick off with you. What is the primary goal of FSVP, and why is this part of FSMA?
Yeah, no, sure. I think that we can just use this as an opportunity to remind people what's Foreign Supply Verification Program all about. And in a nutshell, what it's about is supply chain risk control for imported foods. The events that occurred back in 2007 linked to melamine in pet foods, melamine in wheat gluten, and the consequences of that were really the drivers from both, I think, an FDA and a congressional perspective to look at legislation that was going to significantly tighten up the preventive controls for imported foods. And effectively, that is what Foreign Supply Verification Program is about. It is saying to those who import food, make sure that the importers that you are, or the manufacturers or growers that you are bringing products in from outside of the United States are compliant with the FDA requirements, and that you are addressing risks appropriately in that upstream supply chain. As we'll get into, and we talked last time, this is now closely paralleling what is in the preventive control rules for humans and animals. So it really is all about supply chain risk control. That's what Foreign Supply Verification Program is seeking to do. So I think that's essentially what it is, Jill.
Okay, great. Thanks for that high-level overview, and let's go on to the next question that was submitted. And Melanie, I'll go ahead and have you address this one. And we are in the second round of cycles here. And what's changed from the proposal of foreign supplier verification?
Thanks, Jill, and it's my pleasure to be back to FSMA Fridays. I've taken a bit of a break, but thanks everyone for welcoming me back. And Jill, this is a great question, and it could get to be a long answer. I'm going to endeavor to cut it short, because in general, there's a lot of changes in this reproposal, yet it didn't change the rule a lot, if that makes any sense at all. So let me explain. What changed in this reproposal are the following elements. It removes the requirement to perform a compliance status review. However, what was left and what remains is that some of those requirements emerged instead into the expectations involved in performing the hazard analysis. So an importer needs to conduct a hazard analysis for what's now known as and called significant hazards. That changed, and the vocabulary changed to align with the preventive controls rule. If you read that re-proposal, the preventive controls rule now refers to hazards that used to be called reasonably likely to occur hazards, or RLTO hazards, as we like to use acronyms in FSMA, and they're now known as significant hazards. And so the foreign supplier verification rule vocabulary now aligns with that. So obviously this vocabulary alignment is also a change that we're seeing in the foreign supplier verification rule to match the preventive controls rule, as David earlier mentioned. We're seeing this inter-rule alignment of wording and of vocabulary, which is a really good thing. So things are starting to gel and make more sense between these FSMA rules now. Another change we saw in the rule, Jill, is there's now no need to maintain a list of suppliers. I get a bit of a chuckle out of this. The requirement instead is to the need to make sure that the supplier is approved. Well, how do we do that if we don't have a list of suppliers, right? And even FDA acknowledged this. There's a great line straight out of the rule that says that, you know, we're uncertain how the importer could verify that a food it receives is from an approved foreign supplier, yet be unable to generate a list of approved suppliers. So, you know, there's the chuckle, therein lies the rub. So notwithstanding, you don't need to maintain a list of suppliers, but you need to make sure the supplier is approved. A couple other quick changes. You have to be able to address circumstances in which an unapproved supplier might be used. So sometimes, you know, you go to the spot market, you have to do a spot buy. You have to be able to document in your process by which you are doing that. The rule also identified that the $1 million mark in annual sales is now the definition of a very small importer and a very small foreign supplier. And again, that also then aligns with the preventive controls rule definition for very small business. So again, we're seeing that inter-rule alignment. And last but not least, FDA picked a lane. If you remember, in that initial rule, there were two options that FDA introduced and wanted industry feedback on as to how to perform that supplier verification when there was a risk for serious adverse health consequences or death, when there was a significant hazard, and when there wasn't, that option 1 and that option 2. Well, they picked a lane. And some, like me, would describe that as kind of driving down the median, kind of either picking the third lane or just kind of driving down the median. David and I see this a little different, and I'm going to get a chance to explain that a little bit more in follow-up questions. So I'm going to leave that for later, Jill.
Okay, great. So it really does sound quite a bit more of alignment going on with this re-proposal. And interesting about the supplier list. We'll see if that stays the same or if that changes again. So moving on, let's go ahead and toss this back to you, David. If FSVP is about supply chain control, how is it different, and Melanie, I know you've sort of talked about this a bit, from the revised preventive control for human food rule?
It really isn't. As I said in the first question, Jill, is the goal is to drive to alignment between the two rules. And FDA has actually now done, I think, done a pretty good job of lining these two rules up. And as those of you who were on the call a month ago, and we talked about the preventive control rule and all these changes around supplier controls, which was totally expected. And just as a sidebar, I don't expect for 1 second that any of that is going to go away in the final rule. I think we can take that now as pretty much set in stone. Is we will have supplier risk control requirements in the final rule, and be thinking about how to manage that today, and not waiting till August 2015 to get your head around that. But that being said, essentially, as Melanie said, it's figure out where your significant risks are and control them. So the key ingredient here is you got to do that if you are a domestic company in the United States. Now for your domestic suppliers, preventive control rule. because you are having to do that for your suppliers, domestic and foreign, as a manufacturer in the United States, then you're looking down your list of suppliers, which of course you don't have to keep a list of suppliers, as Melanie has said, but you're looking down your quote list, close quote, of suppliers, and on that list you're saying, okay, I'm sourcing this ingredient from California. I need to determine, is there a risk there? Am I controlling that risk? And do I need to verify with the supplier that the supplier is controlling the risk, and follow through with the requirements of the preventive control rule? I'm sourcing the same ingredient from a second supplier who's outside of the United States. So essentially, we're dealing with the same kind of a risk with regard to the ingredient. And you have to go down exactly the same pathway with that foreign manufacturer, the foreign supplier of that ingredient. It makes no difference in the preventive control rule whether that supplier is in Mexico, Vietnam, or in California. You go through the same process, and you have to establish the same supplier control mechanism. The way these are aligned is that if you have done that as a manufacturer in the United States for the requirements of your preventive control rule, the good news is you won't have to basically reinvent all the paperwork to be compliant with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, because you've already done it as part of your requirements for the preventive control rule. Now, if you're a pure importer and you're basically going to resell the product, and by the definitions of the Foreign Supplier Verification, you'd be deemed as an importer and have to comply. But you're not subject to preventive control rule, then clearly you're going to have to do all this from scratch and run the traps on the risks in the foreign suppliers. So it's a little complex, but it has aligned better. It is certainly boils back down, as I said initially, is understanding the risks in your supply chain and control them. And you can be doing it under the umbrella of the preventive control rule or under the umbrella of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Effectively, same process going on in both, where you need to control those risks. So I think these have aligned pretty nicely.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next question then. Thank you, David. Melanie, I'm going to go ahead and bring you back in on this one. Will the food and beverage importers be expected to do on-site audits of foreign suppliers? Assuming they have the list, of course, right?
or you know, yeah, the list there, wink, wink, not supposed to have, but they have to show that they've approved suppliers, right?
So, absolutely.
In part, they are supposed to do on-site audits, but only for those significant hazards that pose a risk for what we call SACOTA, serious adverse health consequences for humans. Actually, I can take the A off there. So that is where the requirement falls with respect to importers having to do or being required to do on-site audits for foreign suppliers. So this is where I go back to that option 1, option 2, picking a lane, driving down the median analogy that I had mentioned earlier. With respect to the option 1, option 2 of the earlier rule, and in the re-proposal, FDA appears to be going with what looks like the option 1 under the initial rule, in that they're requiring an initial and annual audit for those significant risks that cause serious adverse health consequences for humans in these manufacturing facilities or in the foreign suppliers. But what they did is they added flexibility in that the importer can specifically determine some other verification activity or reduced audit frequency that can be used in lieu of this annual audit. So here's where I come into some level of question. Now, I embrace flexibility in individual decision-making at, at kind of the industry level and the importer level. Where I question this is there's no objective bar here, and that's my issue with it. It's kind of saying you have to do this, but you don't have to do this if you don't think you have to do this. And I know that David sees this differently because he thinks it's going to net out in practice, but I'm a lawyer, so I see it differently because I'm looking at this in writing. And if you look at it in the spirit of the law and its legal impact and enforcement power, I guess I have a little different viewpoint in that you have to do an annual audit if there's serious adverse health consequence or death, significant hazards, unless you think you can do it some other way. And there's no definition, there's no objectivity, there's no measure, there's no I guess bar in the rule that says here's how. And here's our expectations of, there are, it's you have to do lot by lot testing, you have to do sampling. So, there are some criteria here, but it's up to the subjectivity of the individual importer to say, well, I think I've got it covered, so I don't need the on-site audit. So that's where I feel like there's a bit of driving down the median or picking a third lane. And I know that other people would likely disagree with me, but that's my gut reaction. And I'd actually like to flip it over to David to get his perspective because I know we have a little bit of a healthy discourse on this particular topic.
Yeah, no, thanks, Melanie. I'm not sure that we're that unaligned on this because, as you pointed out, the original proposal got the two options in them, and the reproposal has developed this sort of hybrid that if you've got the serious adverse health event or consequence from a situation, then the default is to do an on-site audit, or, as you eloquently pointed out, cover your bases in some other way, and you said it in much more legalistic terms than I did. And that's not been defined. So I'm sitting here as a manufacturer, and I'm looking at this and saying, oh yeah, okay, I've got a hazard that could be serious adverse health event. Salmonella, classic example. And I'm relying on the manufacturer overseas to control that risk. How am I going to comply with foreign supply verification program? Well, my answer to that is the FDA is telling me on-site audit or figure it out yourself. And I'm going to say, I can't be bothered. I don't want to go down a road of, well, I hope I've got it right. I hope I'm covering this some other way. I'm just simply going to default to the on-site audit. So I think legalistically we're in the median, but in practical reality for manufacturer, they're going to say, I'm just not going to take the risk. So I think in practical terms, this is effectively going to force people into option one. With to be specific and acknowledge what you're saying is yes, there's an out, but it's not one that I see as a practical out that people will exercise. So it'll default to option one for the serious ones.
And I guess just to do the typical lawyer rebuttal, and because I'm a paid skeptic as a lawyer, I think that you are so wonderfully the optimist and give people the optimistic route that you will think that everyone would take the optimistic route and say I will take the most conservative approach and opt for the on-site audit, whereas there's going to be some players in the market who will say, that might be the most costly option for me. That might be the most time-consuming option for me. I think I'll take the route of least resistance and try to figure this one out myself because it's the least time-consuming for me and the least costly for me. So that might be a real negative viewpoint, but I have a feeling we have to, as an industry, account for that as a possibility and a potential inevitability.
Well, if I may have a counterpoint to the lawyer, to the counterpoint, just very, very briefly, I don't see it necessarily as the costly option. I think that it raises the question of foreign supplier has had a GFSI audit. Is that is that going to be deemed to be adequate? And let's assume that yes, it is. It's an audit. It's a third-party audit, and you know, let's make the foreign supplier. If you want to sell to me, then you get the audit and you pay for it. So, and just make sure you send me the audit report because I need it for my foreign supply verification program. So I can see it being forced down that road. So anyway, we'll time will tell whether in fact it does sit in the median. The good news is there's options. There's options. So I think we have to recognize that FDA has opened it up a little bit and giving us some wiggle room.
Okay. And I was about to pipe in, but in interest of time, I'm not going to. But definitely, it sounds like you both are aligned. It's just a little different approach on that. So I'm going to move us to the next question. And Melanie, why not? I'm going to throw this to you. And you know, I think it's more in reference to compliance and what we just talked about. You know, will this rule put some of these importers out of business? What's your thought?
You know, I think, and certainly that's not the intention of the rule, Jill. That's certainly not the intention of FDA, but I think that in practical terms, some of these importers just won't want to tackle some of these additional responsibilities and, you know, perceived and actual liabilities, as we've just been discussing. I mean, this is just obviously a big burden and additional set of requirements that these importers aren't used to taking on. And I think the cost and some of these new exposures are something that, you know, these importers are just going to probably throw in the towel. So practically speaking, I think that's the net outcome. You know, that said, do I think that FDA is going to have a lot of these, you know, inspectors with boots on the ground to be able to go practically enforce these requirements and have the intent or desire to put importers out of business? No, I don't think that's what they're looking to do.
Okay. And all we'll take is just a few highlighted out there, right, to put a little more emphasis on it. I'm going to go ahead and jump over just in regards to GFSI and audits. And David, if you can advise, will GFSI audit suffice for the foreign supplier audit?
Yeah, well, I mean, that sort of ties back to what I was saying in response to some of the thoughts from me a few seconds ago. You know, let me answer that by quoting a little bit that's out of the reproposal and just sort of focusing with what's this about. And as I said, it's about supply chain risk control. And what the FDA is saying in this reproposal is what an importer has to do here is to essentially verify the activities of the supplier, and I'm going into quotes here, to provide adequate assurances that the foreign supplier produces food in a manner consistent with FDA's regulations on preventive controls, produce safety, if either is applicable to the foreign supplier, and to assure that that food is not adulterated and not misbranded regarding allergen labeling. So if we look at that and say, well, what's that really mean? It basically is saying this audit has to verify that the foreign supplier is meeting the requirements of the new regulations and that it's not adulterated or misbranded regarding allergen labeling. So if the GFSI audit that's done meets those requirements, then the answer to that question, will GFSI audit do, is yes. As some of those on the call likely know, we've taken a pretty deep dive and looked at a number of the different GFSI schemes and asked this question, are they aligned with preventive control rule? And at least one of them, we've done the same on produce rule. And right now they are pretty aligned. They're not perfect, but they are pretty aligned. So if GFSI schemes tweak themselves enough to be aligned to meet the requirement that I've just quoted, i.e. that foreign supplier is meeting the requirements of these two new rules and allergen labeling, then the answer will be yes. And if I was running GFSI, I would make it so, because absent that, we're going to end up with two different third-party auditor schemes, And I think that GFSI could very easily, or the scheme owners could very easily say, we have the standard global scheme for one of the for whichever one we pick, and there's an addendum that we would do for, quote, foreign supply verification program compliance. There may be a few additional pieces that would go in there. Maybe not, because it'll all align. But ultimately, I think GFSI will work, but GFSI needs to recognize that for it to work, it just has to meet that requirement that I've just talked about, as making sure that the audit will verify the foreign supplier is meeting those requirements for preventive controls, produce rules, and allergen labeling.
So the alignment then with the GFSI schemes.
Yeah,
I'm sure will continue to happen.
Right, and they are already very closely aligned. Mm-hmm. So there's very little lifting that would need to be done, but it needs to be looked at through that lens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question, and Melanie, I'll ask you to take this. Are foreign suppliers aware of what's coming, and are they ready for the changes? My guess is, based on the amount of participation in today's topic, I'm going to say that the awareness is definitely there, but if you could comment, that would be great.
You know, Jill, I just returned from Asia, from China and Thailand specifically, and until that trip, I would have agreed with you, but boy, I really don't think there is a lot of awareness. I don't think a lot of foreign companies really see this coming, and if they do, if they really appreciate the lift involved. Not that there is a significant lift when we really look at it, at least from a U.S. perspective or where U.S. companies are at, but after really digging deep into some of the practical practices in some of these foreign companies and just understanding the differences of HACCP, for example, and the implementation of HACCP, and then the need under FSMA to elevate HACCP to HARP-C and develop a food safety plan, these companies have to start preparing now. So I think maybe the upper few percent of foreign companies maybe understand FSMA, but the rest of them really haven't heard of it. Or if they've heard of it, they're not really appreciating the fact that they've got to get started and they've got to start preparing for it now. So, I mean, a stronger message yet is U.S. companies who are relying on foreign suppliers for their ingredients or finished products, if you've ever thought about launching an education or training campaign with your suppliers, particularly your foreign suppliers, do it on this topic and start it now, because I really don't think the awareness is out there.
Oh, interesting. Well, and that sort of segues really to the next question. David, if you want to comment, what should U.S. importers be doing now to get ready? And, Melanie, put out one suggestion for sure, but what else can you add to this? Oops, David, are you still there? Oops, I think, let's see. David, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, there you go. Yes, I think we had you muted. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, see, that's all right. That's all right. I know when you're trying to shut me down, Jill. No, I think Melanie hit the key point there is obviously, like all these rules, understand what they mean, and we've sort of gone over some of the key points here, and as you're thinking about foreign supplier verification for your compliance with preventive control rules, just apply the same lens, the same thinking, with a few little tweaks, but it's essentially the same approach. And I think I share exactly the same concerns that Melanie does. I think that there is a few foreign suppliers, foreign manufacturers overseas, particularly those ones that are well connected with the U.S., who understand that this is coming and beginning to get their head around what they need to do. But the vast majority don't have a clue. And it is not like, yeah, we're just going to sit and relax and wait for the final rules. There's a little bit of that, but I think many of them are completely oblivious to what's coming. And I think that number one is raise the awareness and start to have the companies recognize that where they're going to need to be for compliance. And really what this boils down to is these foreign manufacturers have to be compliant with the new rules. That's effectively what it's saying. Even though, obviously, as I said earlier, the audit part of this, the documentation that they're compliant in a lot of detail is for those serious adverse event situations. I think the other point here would be bearing in mind what I said earlier about the alignment between the preventive control rule and the foreign supply verification program is as domestic companies are starting to look at what they're going to have to do to be compliant with preventive controls on supply chain risk control, as you're going through that, ask yourself, does this make me compliant with the foreign supply verification program? Because if it does, that's one less lift I've got to do. I thought I was going to have to do foreign supply verification program, but these reproposals has actually now taken that off my plate because I know I've got to be compliant with preventive controls. So I think that's another lens to look at this at is for domestic companies, because it may be that this one goes away for them because of their requirements. Now, the lifting doesn't all go away because you basically got to do this as part of preventive control rule. But the good news is you don't have to do it twice. We'll have two sets of information that documents it under preventive control and foreign supplier. So I think that's the other thing to be doing is starting to think seriously about your supply chain risk control in general, because there'll be a lot of overlap, as I said earlier.
Okay. And moving on. Oh, no, I'll just sort of last question actually is just sort of a comment. I think in reference to this, I'm going to go ahead and take us out of full screen too, or anyone who has questions, go ahead and submit them. We were talking a lot today about preparing for compliance and if importers or foreign suppliers are getting prepared. And I think the question we often get at SafetyChain is how can we help in automating the FSMA compliance? So just a brief, again, sort of overview of how SafetyChain can help. Comprehensive supplier compliance is a key component, and it absolutely applies to all the topics we're talking about today in preparation, whether it's scheduling, monitoring, and validating all your plant components and giving you real-time non-conformance alerts. I think that the main thing from compliance also is just making sure you have all your documents in central repositories. You can be audit ready on demand, you can do risk assessment, continuous improvement, and so forth. So again, those are just sort of all the components from a how do you get ready for FSMA that SafetyChain can help from an automation standpoint. David, Melanie, we have quite a few questions. I know typically we wrap up here in a half hour. I am going to ask if you could stay on for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll address some of these questions. For those of you that cannot stay on with us today, thank you so much as always for joining us, and we will you will be getting a recording of today's session on Monday, as well as we have a few other webcasts and things coming up that might be of interest. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and start firing away some questions here. Let me go ahead and go to the top of the list. There's quite a few that have come in, and we'll get going. The first question in is, where does this responsibility lie with the broker, with the customer or broker, and what steps need to be documented? And David, do you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, no, sure.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Jill?
Yeah,
I just want to make sure that you haven't sort of
yes.
hit your mute button
Put you
again.
on mute again. No, not this time.
Yeah, I know what you're trying to do with me. You're trying to shut me down. No, I think that question falls on the definition of the importer, and the importer is defined, as best I can tell, and Melanie may have some thoughts on this one, as the person or entity that causes that food to be imported into the United States. If the manufacturer who's using that food is simply calling up the broker and say, hey, I need 5 containers of X, go find it for me at the best price that you can find. It's the manufacturer that is causing that food to be imported, and the burden is on the manufacturer, not on the broker. Keep in mind that FDA recognizes that brokers are not necessarily food safety savvy groups of people, and they didn't align the foreign supplier verification program requirements identically with the importer of record requirements for the Bioterrorism Act. They could simply have said, if you're the importer of record, you need to be the person who is ensuring compliance with FSMA, and they didn't do that. So I think it isn't exactly black and white, but I suspect a lot of brokers will not have to be compliant. But if you're buying from a broker, you will have to be compliant, which will create a nightmare because the broker may not tell you who they're buying from. And if they buy from somebody who's not compliant and FDA comes and does an inspection and looks at your programs, and you can't determine that you've controlled those risks because you're buying it from the broker, then woe's you. So on the one hand, I think brokers won't have to do this. On the other hand, I think brokers are going to feel a great deal of pain and may actually suffer significant in terms of loss of business because the manufacturer will not be able to rely on them to be able to feed through that information. It's just not necessarily the way brokers work. They want to keep their sources secret. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's a complex question. Very good question.
Right, right. Okay, moving on to the next one. Phil's asking, is it necessary to get an audit or other testing for domestic suppliers? Are importers being put in a position to buy only U.S. ingredients as to avoid going out of business? That's a pointed question. Melanie, do you want to take that, or David?
Yeah, Melanie, do you want to give that a shot?
Sure. I mean, I think that the whole point of having supplier verification come back into the preventive controls rule was to level the playing field, and so that there was no trade barrier issues like this surfacing, so that there was an even playing field with respect to where you're purchasing from, and that there wasn't a favoritism, if you will. I don't know how David sees that, but I think that was one of the main, maybe not one of the main, but that was certainly an intent of that. So I don't think that importers should necessarily be swayed of where they buy their materials from, with respect to simply the domicile of the supplier.
Right. No, I think I would agree with you.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. As I said, there's a good few, and we'll wrap up here just in a few minutes. Jose is asking, based on the fact that HACCP or any food safety system is not a zero-risk system, why the FDA rule for auditors will remove the certification to auditors that inspected facilities involved in recalls and food safety issues?
Yeah, let me try and take that one.
Okay.
That question is actually morphing over into the third-party audit rule. And where this is going is the third-party audit rule is and remember that rule is around accredited auditors. It's around auditors that seek specific accreditation through that program, which FDA has yet to establish, but they get accredited through that program. And with that accreditation, they can issue certificates for high-risk foods, and we haven't seen what that looks like yet, and the FDA hasn't started to require that. But those accredited auditors can issue the certificates for the high-risk foods, and they can issue the certificates to be compliant with the voluntary qualified importer program, which is another thing we haven't seen yet. That's all they do. If they're out doing a routine audit, then for some other purpose or to be compliant with foreign supplier verification program, they don't have to be accredited to do that. And as the question has pointed out, the proposed third-party audit rule has basically said, okay, if that person that you've audited to issue those certificates gets a recall, you're out of business. You lose your accreditation, which is a very, very stringent and I think punitive consequence, because we all know audits don't necessarily catch a completely unanticipated and unexpected problem, and bad things happen to good people. So I think that's a completely unrealistic and unreasonable. Maybe I should flip that around. I think it's certainly unreasonable. It's not unrealistic. It's doable, but I think it's a very unreasonable component to the third-party audit rule. Why it's in there, I don't know. Whether it'll stay in the final rule, again, I don't know.
what is it, mid-December to comment on that? Is that what it is?
Well, no, this one's done.
That one's done, that's right, yes.
Yeah, no, this one's done, but they didn't put out a reproposal on the third-party audit rule. You know, frankly, if somebody feels strongly, I'd still put a comment in on this one. FDO says, you know, you can't comment on stuff that we haven't put the reproposal out, so you're probably wasting your breath. But it'll help lower your blood pressure, so give it a shot.
There you go, perfect. Just a couple more quick questions here. We'll wrap up here in about a minute. Just a reminder, someone's asking, can you advise again what the acronym is for dangerous ingredients? I think the person put in something like, well, it said SAD or SADH. Melanie or
yes,
do you remember what that is?
Yeah, I can. I think I was the one who mentioned that. It's for serious adverse health consequence or death to humans or animals. So it's SAHCODHA. SAHCODHA.
Just real quick. Yeah, and as Melanie's just said, and just remember, this is animals too. So this fund supply verification program isn't just for human foods; it's for animals.
Okay.
So the A on the end is for animals.
Yes. Wow. And that's a big one. Maybe I'll put that in the follow-up email so everyone can remember that one. I'm going to go ahead and just throw one last question. We'll wrap up today's series, this session. And David, I'll go ahead and ask you to comment on this. There's a couple questions here. What is FDA's definition of contamination? Would a product from the ground, i.e. from a spill point, be considered a contamination? And if so, what's the rationale since animal feed is dumped on the ground of feedlots, such as manure, et cetera?
Okay. This is sort of spinning back to animal preventive control. Okay, no, I get that. The original version of the animal preventive control rule would say, no, you can't use that. I think the FDA realized that was actually, you know, not a public health move for the exact same reasons that the question is asking, is if you're going to dump it over into a dirty trough or directly onto the ground, then what's the big deal? And in the revision of the preventive controls for animals, they took that part out. And really what they're saying is focus on chemical and physical risks in situations like that. So if frankly, my belief is what this means in practical reality is that if you drop food on the floor, you can absolutely stick that in the bin that's going to go to the animal. I think that's perfectly okay. But in the process, if that food has fallen on an oil spill, then no, you shouldn't do that. If it's just being dumped in the animal feed cart with a bunch of sweepings that includes old gloves and bits of wire and parts of plastic, no, you cannot do that. But if it's just, quote, a microbiological contaminant, then yeah, that's okay. So the FDA is trying to differentiate that. So hopefully that adds a little clarity to that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think we about covered all the questions today. If we didn't get to your questions, we will take them and hopefully get them at next session. So again, thank you for everyone joining us. Melanie, it was wonderful to have you back. Thank you for, as always, your perspective, as well as David. Thank you for joining us today. And happy Halloween, happy FSMA Fridays, and we'll see everyone in November. Thanks so much.
Thank you.